Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 8, which is market equilibrium and product price. That should say perfect competition, not percent. I did not catch that. That's the book's error. Anyway, moving on. Maybe I'll fix it later. So we've already talked a little bit about demand, and supply is the same, just opposite. So supply comes from the producer. And the way that a supply curve becomes established is basically it is the quantity supplied by producers at various prices. So what that's what the book wants you to understand. And as we look at two important points, you have the shutdown point, which we already covered in chapter 6. You remember that? That's where your average variable cost and your marginal costs are equal. So at the shutdown point, you're not covering your fixed costs. So you're going to go out of business. And then we had your break-even point, which is where you're breaking even. You're not making any profit, but you're breaking even. And that is where your average total cost equal your marginal costs. So they're just showing those points. And then your profit maximizing point is where your marginal revenue is going to equal your marginal cost. So those are a couple things that are review from chapter 6 that we took a look at. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the market supply curve, and we can think about the market supply curve just like we just said. It's the quantity brought to the marketplace by different producers at a particular price. So in this case, I love their names. Gary Grower will bring 2 tons of broccoli to the marketplace at $1.50 a pound or whatever the price is. Whereas Ima Gardner, in her production, she can only bring 1 ton. She's not as efficient. She doesn't produce as much, whatever it is. She's only bringing 1 ton to the market. So if we sum those two together, we can see that the total amount brought to the market at $1.50 per pound would be 3 tons, 1 from Ima, 2 from Gary. And then Gary's also more efficient, so he can bring 1 ton at $1 a pound. So that gives us 2 points, and we can draw that upward sloping line that represents the market supply. Okay, so the next thing they're trying to get you to think about is this idea of producer surplus. And the producer surplus represents graphically the profit that a producer receives. So basically, producer surplus is the supply curve here is upward sloping, and then you have the price of the product, and producer surplus is this area above the product price up to the market supply curve. Any place in that area is considered a profitable point for the producer, and that is considered to be producer surplus. Okay, so in this example, I had to look at this one a couple times. They're just showing you the summation of how you get a demand curve. So go back to demand. Remember, demand is downward sloping. So in this case, consumer 1 would buy 6 items at this particular price, and consumer 2 would only be able to afford, just a different person would be able to afford 3 items at this particular price. So if we sum them together, that's where we get this 9 down here in our supply and demand intersection here. So that's where we get 6 plus 3 is 9 total items bought by consumers. That's the demand curve. And then suppliers, the summation of supply. Producer 1 can bring 5 at that particular price, and producer 2 can bring 4 at that particular price. So again, we have 9 items in the marketplace, and that is where we get this point of equilibrium. So market equilibrium is the point where supply and demand intersect, and that is also market price. And equilibrium doesn't last for very long. It's constantly in flux. As we know, market prices change all the time. So market equilibrium is the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at here is factors that affect demand, which we already studied. We studied this way back in chapter 4. We were talking about demand, and then we talked about elasticity and all that kind of stuff. So we learned this already. The only thing you're seeing now is you're now seeing a supply curve put into the supply and demand lines. So that's kind of a good thing. So it lets us understand things better. So here's a demand curve, and the demand curve moves. The supply stays the same, but demand curve moves. So D, and then we call this D prime with a little asterisk. So we can see what happens when we have a shift in demand. So this shift in demand, as you already should know, could be caused by something like an increase in income. So when consumers get more income, they buy more things, as you see on the quantity curve. So remember, there's two equilibriums here. The equilibrium is at this price, this quantity is brought to the marketplace, everyone's happy. Consumers, we have a good year, the economy is doing well, consumers have more disposable income, they buy more of this product, whatever it is. Let's say it's almonds. So they buy more almonds. So demand shifts up, and in order to bring that quantity to the marketplace, producers will only bring more if you pay more money. So prices go up, and consumers then bring a greater quantity to the market. So that is an increase in demand and an increase in quantity supplied. Okay, here's the reverse. So in this case, again, we're looking at a shift in demand, and this could be caused by a change in consumer preferences. Let's say that a product is no longer considered healthy, or there's a disease outbreak in the market and people don't want to buy the product anymore. So we start out with the demand here, equilibrium, price is pretty high, things are looking good. Then a E. coli outbreak happens in lettuce and demand shifts to the left. So now eventually what happens is consumers purchase less and there is no demand for the product. So producers can't sell their product. What they do sell is for a low price. So that shows a shift in demand to the left. Okay, those are really important graphs. Okay, here's two more. So this one, we're now looking at a shift in supply. So remember, supply is created by producers. Farmers are producers, so they create supply. So we start with S, and then we move to S prime. And it doesn't really matter, the shape here, they're not perfectly parallel, that doesn't matter. So what could happen to make this supply shift? And notice what happens. Here's our first equilibrium right here. Prices are pretty high, quantity supply is pretty low. Okay, we have a shift in supply. Let's say this is 2018, this is 2019. We have a shift in supply. Now we have lower prices and we have a greater quantity brought to the marketplace. This is a typical supply curve that you would see for a bumper crop, a good crop year. So producers are bringing a greater quantity to the market. Consumers will buy it, but they only buy it at a lower price. Okay. This one is a shift in supply to the left. So what happens here, 2018, crop year, prices were somewhere in the middle, looking fine. And then we have a drought, or we have a flood, or we have something else that damages the ability of the crop to be harvested. So we have a shift in supply to the left. And you have less quantity produced, a new equilibrium, which is a much higher price. So consumers want the product. There's not as much there. They're going to have to pay a higher price in order to get the quantity that they had in the past or that they want. So those are two good examples of a shift in supply. Okay. So we can use the concepts of market demand and supply to assess the effects of events in the economy that have upon the economic well-being of consumers and producers in a particular market during a specific period. We do this by using this idea of the total economic surplus, which I can see did not make it on the screen. However, it is in your textbook. Darn, I should have looked at this a little better. Anyway, I just gave you two examples of how a drought could affect the crop, creating a shortage, and how a bumper crop or a good crop year could affect the overall economic surplus of consumers and producers. Okay, so this slide looks at the area of consumer surplus, which is in the area 1 is consumer surplus. So this area is consumer surplus, and that is a benefit to society because consumers basically get what they want at a particular price. Producer surplus is in area 2, again by the supply curve. So that is producer surplus. Okay, so if we look at this idea of producer surplus, we can see that a shift in supply to the left, remember supply is created by the producer, a shift in supply to the left, which would be causing a drought, would decrease the amount of consumer surplus and would also decrease producer surplus. But producers would gain a little bit because, of course, prices be higher. The idea here is that a drought would cause a supply shift to the left. Okay, so this is an important slide. And what this slide shows right here is the idea of market surplus. So market equilibrium is right here. That's when producers and consumers are happy. Producers are getting what they want, a fairly good price. Consumers are getting what they want for a good price. When you have a surplus, that's all of this area. So a surplus is any price above the equilibrium price. You're going to do a homework assignment, you're going to want to remember that. Any price above the equilibrium price is surplus. Look what happens. Producers bring too much to the market. Consumers only want to buy this much. Producers are bringing this much. You say, well, how do I know how much that is? Well, you can go over to the price and drop down, and that is what the quantity that consumers would want at that particular price, because that's a high price. Whereas producers at that price are going to bring a huge amount to the market. So the only way to get rid of a surplus is to get back to equilibrium, and that is to lower prices. On the other hand, when you have a shortage, a lot of times you don't think about how a shortage works. So a lot of times a shortage is created because producers face low prices for a long period of time. So they go out of business, they stop producing that product, maybe there wasn't demand for it, or it could be going back to the idea of a bad crop year or something like that. But a shortage is when consumers would readily buy more, but producers are only bringing a small quantity to market. So, and that example is right here. So at this particular price, producers are only going to bring this small quantity to the market. Consumers would want to buy this large quantity over here. So in a way to remedy a shortage is to increase market prices. If we increase market prices, producers are going to bring more to the marketplace. Consumers are going to have to pay more, but that they want more if there is a shortage. So those are two really good slides. You're probably going to want to come back and take a look at them. And I think that's about it for this chapter. They talk about the cobweb adjustment to equilibrium. And basically, that comes about because producers, think about it, this really happens in farming, producers base their decisions on last year and last year's prices and last year's costs of inputs and things like that, whereas consumers respond to current prices. So that is how we get this cobweb adjustment that the textbook talks about. And you can read a little bit more about that if you want, because I'm just about out of time on my slide presentation. Okay, so we learned about market equilibrium. Price and quantity are given by the intersection of demand and supply. Producer surplus is the profit earned by the producers. Economic surplus is producer surplus plus consumer surplus. And a market surplus exists when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. All right, I think that's it for this week. Have a great week.